Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to all to this World Human Sciences and Management Conference 2021. This is Rudranarayan Das, Executive Director, Center for Adivasi Research and Development. We are proud to announce that this conference is conducted along with Indian Institute of Management Sambalpur, Central University of Odisha Koraput, and Ravenshaw University Cuttack Odisha. I welcome the guest speaker for today's session, one of the very finest communication professor, is none other than Professor Daya Kishan Thussu, and participants across the globe through Facebook and YouTube Live, and who are here to listen Professor Thussu. The broader theme of this conference is agnotological context, disciplinary practices of social sciences, and policy frames. On behalf of Center for Adivasi Research and Development, I extend my profound gratitude to our patrons, Professor Dr. Mahadev Jaiswal, Director, Indian Institute of Management, Professor Sarath Kumar Palita, Vice Chancellor, Central University of Odisha, and Professor Dr. Sanjay Kumar Nayak, respected Vice Chancellor, Ravenshaw University, Cuttack. The convener of this largest virtual gathering, our eminent Indian historian, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, and eminent policy activist, writer, and philanthropist, Mr. Charudat Panigrahiji. The main outcome of this conference is to come up with the national and international framework for the education system in future. The crux of this conference will be used of digital technologies such as artificial intelligence, augmented reality, and virtual reality that is being increasingly adopted after the outbreak of COVID-19. We hope this conference would help students, faculties, researchers, and all to expand their mental horizon and help the education system to adopt the best. Dear friends, Center for Adivasi Research and Development is a leading research-oriented institution promoting ethnographic, empirical, and evidence-based research for engaging and addressing the challenges that 21st century globe is facing today. The prime agenda of this institution is to come up with potential policy solutions for social change while believing in the idea of 3D, debate, dialogue, and discussion, and E3, expertise, experiencing, and education. The institution focuses on marginalized communities and works for their livelihood to protect the nature, culture, language, and identity in particular. The age of modernity has witnessed that change is the only constant phenomenon for societal purpose to enhance knowledge. Our information work for them is methodical and avoids paradoxically framework which neglected so many centuries from theories to become practice. The center sincerely believes in the concept of social marketing, which is seriously looking for non-profit marketing and build new social entrepreneurship for check and balance mechanism to glorify generations to come. The Center for Adivasi Research and Development come to serve with a holistic approach of critical thinking in education to fill the gaps, to plan accordingly for the voiceless communities. In this evening, we have with us eminent professor in the field of communication, Professor Dr. Daya Kishan Thussu, analyzing the impact of emerging giants, China and India, on the geopolitical of global communication is the ambitious task that Professor Daya Thussu has decided to set himself. He is working on a monograph, The Changing Geopolitics of Global Communication, which will draw on 2 decades of work on the political aspects of international communication. His book suggests that a new global communication order is emerging. Professor Thussu calls for a more innovative, inclusive, and cosmopolitan research dialogue, cutting across disciplinary and intellectual boundaries to address the emerging landscape of global communication in a polycentric world. The availability of media material emanating from major non-Western centers of production complicates the discourse about global communication, he argues. Professor Thussu spent 14 years at the University of Westminster in London before joining the Department of Journalism in September 2019. However, he is no stranger to Asia Giants at Westminster. He was co-director of its India Media Center and research advisor to its China Media Center. Before taking off, he his HKBU post, he was a visiting professor in an inaugural Disney chair in global media uh, at Tsinghua University, Beijing. Born in India, he continues to pay close attention to developments there. His book, Communicating India's Soft Power, Buddha to Bollywood, was a major contribution to scholarship on the country's public diplomacy and soft power. The book informed a documentary produced for the Public Diplomacy Division of Indian Ministry of External Affairs, in which he featured. Professor Thussu is passionate about internationalizing media research. Being a student of international politics, he was struck by how much of the international media and communication discourse was shaped by United States-led Western institutions and industries. Professor Thussu says American communication and media schools have produced the majority of textbook and journal publishing in the area, closely followed by Britain. That he believes that, as in many other fields, the rise or should be return of China and India to global prominence, coinciding with the crisis of neoliberal model of US-led Western capitalism, will challenge traditional thinking and research paradigms of international media and communication as power begins to swing away from the West. In this evening, Professor Thussu will be talk over the topic BRICS Media, Reshaping the Global Communication Order. Now, without taking much time, I would like to invite Dr. Thussu to initiate his talk. Over to Dr. Thussu.
Thank you, Professor Das, for that very lengthy introduction of my work. And thank you, Dr. Bikram Jena, for inviting me to be part of this conference. I'm really honored and pleased to be speaking to friends and colleagues and students and researchers, mostly I expect in India. But since it's going live on YouTube and on Facebook, potentially it might be viewed by people across the world. As was mentioned, I have been researching and writing about international aspects of media and communication for a very long time. And what I'm going to share with you this evening is a part of my recent publication published earlier this year in 2021 in relation to the BRICS media, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. I think it's also a coincidence that the BRICS chairmanship this year, for 2021, is with India. So I'm going to talk about the BRICS nations, who are the big players within it, and I want to focus specifically on the digital dimensions of communication in these very big, diverse countries, and how that might influence the existing global communication order, which has been established, shaped, controlled, dominated by largely, not exclusively, largely the US and its allies, and how that is being challenged. So I have a few slides to share with you and see if I can use the, yes, I think I can. So please let me know if you can see the screen.
Yes,
I've got, thank you. I've got my email there, so I'll be happy to take you might have any questions, comments. We'll have time for Q&A after I finish talking. But if you have further queries or you want some clarifications, please don't hesitate to contact me on my email. I still prefer to use email rather than other social media platforms. And I'm also, although I've been using Zoom as most of us have been for last 18 months, I'm not very good with negotiating my presentation with comments which pop up in the comment section. So I would, if you send me some comment, I may not be able to respond. Of course, after the talk is over, we will have probably the organizers will pick up questions and I'll be happy to respond. It sort of breaks my chain of thought. So I apologize before I start. BRICS, I mean, this is a group of countries. Some people might argue it has had its age. It was, comprised of countries which are very, very different. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa came later. Some people argue what is common amongst these countries. They're very different countries, very different political systems, very different media and communication environment and systems, and also various levels of development. So what is the common factor which unites, if that's the right word, these group of large, diverse countries? So a little bit of history. The idea of creating a group of nations, big economies, really came originally from Russia. And the first summit of the BRICS nations was held in 2009. And since then, every year there has been a summit. This year also, it was of course virtual like last year. This year it was hosted by Prime Minister Modi, because India is chairing the BRICS BRICS group this year. It's an annual chairmanship. But the timing of this grouping is interesting. It emerged soon after the 2007-8 economic crisis, which was arguably the worst crisis since the Wall Street crash in the 1920s. And countries like Russia, China, India, Brazil, BRIC, as they were described in popular media and also in policy discourses later, came together. But since then, as I said, the original idea came from Russia. These countries came together regularly every year. China has become much more dominant player in this grouping. And it was China's suggestion, and some would say insistence, that South Africa was included in this group because China wanted it to be global. So you have Latin American presence, you have Asian presence, you have European, in the sense that Russia is partly in Europe, at least culturally, if not physically, geographically, and China and India are in Asia. So the idea was that there should be representation from Africa. So there has been a lot of work done on BRICS, different aspects of its geopolitical aspects, economic exchanges, etc. Relatively little work on the media among these countries, for very obvious reasons, very different systems, very different media structures, etc. But I was very fortunate to be involved in which was actually a pioneering project, a major project on studying the BRICS media. Um, this was a project based in Finland, led by Professor Carly Nordenström, who some of you may know, a very well-known figure in international communication. So he ran this project for 4 years, and it was funded by the Finnish Academy. And the idea was that in all these 5 countries, we'll have local researchers who would give us a granular, a detailed understanding of media systems, media structures, media practices across these countries. I was involved in it from the very beginning, and we produced this book, which came out, I think it was 2015, if I'm not, I think 2015, which I edited with Professor Nordenström, simply called Mapping BRICS Media. And then 2 years later, we published another book by 2 of the members of this group, Dr. Svetlana Pasti and Professor Jyotika Ramprasad. Jyotika is based in US, Svetlana is in Finland. And this was specifically about journalism in BRICS countries based on detailed data that they had covered and generated through their research collaborators across these countries. And earlier this year, this final book of this project came out. Again, I was directly involved in this. And today's talk is largely drawing on this book called BRICS Media, Reshaping the Global Communication Order. As you see, there's a question mark at the end of that title, because we are raising this question: is it reshaping, or is it capable of reshaping, or is there something called BRICS Media, or are we talking about different types of countries within BRICS nations and their domination of global media, or their potential challenge to the dominant structures? This book is, if you haven't had the chance to look at it, I would recommend it, not just because I edited it, but there's a chapter in it which I wrote, which sort of makes this, what I think is an interesting intervention in terms of how we perceive the internet. So the idea of, is BRICS as a group capable of de-Americanizing the internet? So some of what I'm going to discuss with you today, or hopefully we'll have time for discussion, but what I'm presenting, and perhaps we'll have Q&A, is drawing on this particular chapter. All 3 books were published in a series that I edit. I'm series editor for this. It's published by Routledge in London, but also in New York. It's called Internationalizing Media Studies, a series that I set up in 2009, and I'm still managing this. And this is, again, the idea is to kind of broaden the parameters of our field, to just get over this standard Western, or not just Western, but American domination of communication theories and even practices. So, as I said, within BRICS, the dominant player is China. And BRICS itself has very serious differences, not just our political system. Actually, as we know, in relation to India, there has been differences bordering on hostility. Actual, as we know, last year on the border in northern India, there was actual combat. So some people argue, oh, that's it, that's end of this BRICS. This just, if the two major countries in Asia are not are actually fighting each other, how could that be a group? But it has survived. We just mentioned this year the summit was held, and Mr. Modi addressed the other group, the other members. But the heart of this is really China. And China's argument is that, look, we are not the only rising power. There are these others also, Russia, Brazil, India, even South Africa. And this idea of the rest not to threaten Americans. Of course, in the last 2 years, especially, they've become much more vocal and talk much more in terms of binary, United States versus China. And as we know, we're going through this new Cold War, so it's become much more pronounced. But the idea of using this forum as a mechanism to tell the Western world largely, look, we are not threatening you because these other countries are also rising. But unlike the other 4 members, the rise of China is not rising, it's a risen country already. And I want to share some of the information which is available in public domain that we often do not engage with, apart from specialists. One very clear indication of that risen power is just look at where the corporate power is. Very important in this age of neoliberalism and corporate colonization of the globe, if you like. Now, last year, in this COVID year, something really significant happened. For the first time in history, there were more companies in Fortune 500, which were Chinese than American, 124 versus 121. And I did some data crunching. If you look at this chart from in the last 20 years, from 10 to 124. And there is a corresponding decline in the number of companies which make it to the global 500. Now, as you know, this is a very well-known business magazine published by a major publishing group in the United States. It's been doing this kind of gradation of companies since late 1950s. And until end of the 19th century, it was more basically American companies, some Western European companies, and Japan. That was it. The rest of the world was like 10 companies, 20 companies. Today is a very different picture. You might also say companies are not just, cannot directly identified with the country. They're global. They have money from different sources. Absolutely true. But they're still located in certain countries, and there is, in China's case especially, there is also a lot of state intervention because China has a different kind of capitalism than what you and I might consider capitalism to be. So what's happening in the BRICS and beyond has to be considered with this basic shift in power, that majority of the world's top companies are now Chinese. And also it's very important, this is not Chinese government data. This has come from a well-known business publication, American business publication. And then you have this, the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, which is arguably the largest infrastructure project in history. 900 projects, trillions of dollars to be spent. And as you see on this map, There are various projects, and they are almost global in their reach. And some of these, which are directly impacting on India, is already China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is the flagship project of BRI. Now, of course, because of COVID, there has been a setback to some of those projects. And there's also in many countries where they've invested, they realize they're not going to get their money back. So there's all the debates about debt diplomacy and, trying to affect policy, etc., which is also very true. But just for a moment, think of the scale of what it entails and compare it with the Marshall Plan, which was introduced in Western Europe after the Second World War to ensure that Americans stayed in Europe. Now, this is 50 times bigger, and the geographical location is the region is much wider. So just think of what happened as a result of Marshall Plan. The Americans are still in Europe, including in a military presence, sizable military presence. So just think what might happen if all these projects come to fruition in the next decade, which is unlikely because there's so many ifs and buts associated. But it gives you a sense of the scale of change that is already underway. And it's interesting, India was one of the few major economies which refused to join BRI. Still is not a member of BRI because of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Some of the projects pass through territory which are disputed, and no government in Delhi, whether it is Mr. Modi's government or even extreme CPM left-wing government in power, which is unlikely, but would say, yes, this is okay. Although there might be people interested in getting associated with these lots of projects and make some money, and I'm sure that's already happening. Even more important is this, the I call it changing geopolitics of global trade. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm currently working on a book on this idea of changing geopolitics of global communication. But you cannot study communication on its own without looking at the other factors. So this is a map I saw in this book by Parag Khanna called Connectography, which was published a few years ago. Today, the numbers have even gone higher. So the countries with which China is the largest trading partner, 124. Countries for which America is the largest trading partner, 56. The double. And the number has grown for China. And both for the BRI and also many of these trade deals, digitization is increasingly important. In the BRI, there's a whole idea of digital Silk Road, wherever Chinese presence is, especially in developing world, digital connectivity is part of the package. So if you want, to get Chinese investment, let us give you satellites, let's give you Wi-Fi, let's give you broadband, and then I can also supply you our programming. Just a very clear foreign policy and soft power project, if you like. But the digital space where all this is happening. I mean, these two slides I showed you, this one and the previous one, just to put it in a broader context of the shift in economic power. But my talk is about communications. I'm coming to that. And I want to concentrate on the digital communication because everything is moving in that realm anyway. So that space is still, to a very large extent, dominated by a very few massively powerful American companies. So here is a chart of companies: Apple, Alphabet, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon. Alphabet, of course, the company which owns Google. They're all now trillion-dollar companies. So their market capitalization is much bigger than the GDP of many, many countries on the planet. And they're awash with cash. They have so much money, they don't know what to do with it. So the digital space continues to be dominated by not just the United States, that would be unfair, by a few companies based in the United States. They're also very important in terms of infrastructure, not just software, infrastructure. So this is the map of, this is slightly older, 2017 figure. I didn't include in this presentation. I have a later map which shows the range of same people, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, are also investing heavily in digital infrastructure for internet, especially. Although there are others, and China is investing a lot of money, India has investment, Russia, European countries, etc., etc. But the big guys are, again, the same companies. Also, in terms of the systems on which internet works. For instance, think of Chrome, which dominates browsers around the world. I'm sure most of us, I use it. I'm sure most of people on this session, whether by Zoom or other platforms, use it. 65.8% of global share is one company. Safari, Apple, 18%. Edge, Microsoft, 3.2%. Samsung, 3%. Firefox, 3%. Internet Explorer exists but small. The Chinese one, QQ, 1.2%. Etc. Yandex is Russian, 0.5%. We are absent. We have massive internet, but we don't have our platforms. We're quite happy for American companies to do that for us. Speaking of India, that is. So you see here, if you look at the American companies who dominate the basic infrastructure for computing, 65, 18, and 3, just do your maths. And look at China, 1.29. Because much of QQ is in China, is not, and Chinese are also using Chrome. So from the infrastructure to commerce to governance of the internet, one could argue, and many have, that China, the US and the companies based in the US are ahead of everybody else. But internet usage has changed. Infrastructure hasn't. In fact, arguably, it's become even more in control of these big companies. But the usage people are using, who are using the internet, that has changed and changed profoundly. So when internet started to go private and global in the 1990s, as you see on this chart, 61% of the users were American. By 2014, that figure had shrunk to 10%. the growth was, if you look at it, 23% was in China alone and 28% in rest of Asia. That includes big countries, including Indonesia, India, South Asia more broadly. That's 2014. Today, the figure is even more astounding. US is single digit. And growth in big countries, especially in Asia and the BRICS nations, both India and China, is huge. Internet is becoming Asian. So in terms of internet users, this is from March 2021, latest available data, 2.7 billion users, largest number in the world is in Asia. But the penetration rate, if you look at the right side of the slide, is below the global average. Global average is 66% nearly. Asia is short, 64%. So growth is going to be continuous for the next decade, at least, if not longer. Top 10 internet users. China, obviously, largest number, 904 million. India, US, Indonesia, Brazil, Nigeria, Russia, Japan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. These are last year's figures. So obviously these figures change every month. Millions others are joining. China is now over 1 billion. India is also getting towards 800 million mark. And COVID and all what it implied has actually forced people to join the digital world. But what's interesting in this is the figures in red. Percentage not online. In the United States, only 4%. In Japan, 10%. In Pakistan, 59%. In India, 46%. China, 37%. Right? Nigeria, 34%. So the growth, Russia, 24%. The future growth is going to come not from Europe or America. They're already saturated markets. They are going to come from big population countries in the developing world. And India, of course, has seen phenomenal growth in, Card Odisha, can you mute your thing so there's no interference? I can hear some tapping. If you could mute yourself, that'll be helpful. So
It's okay, sir.
Yeah, okay. So you see in this slide, I can still hear the noise. Maybe it's the other card, Odisha one, not your director card. So if you could request them to mute, that will be helpful. So from 5.5 million, thank you, in 20 years ago to 600, but actually, as I showed you earlier, is 743. Prediction was it will be 600 million. It's already off by nearly 150 million. So extraordinary growth. I called it the world's biggest internet because the largest internet, of course, is in China, but that is not open. That is closed. The Indian internet is open, and it is the largest open internet in the world. And as I indicated earlier, this is going to be even bigger in coming decade. One of the most significant change that has happened in recent years, especially in last 5 years, is the growth of internet through this public-private partnership, and private more than public, honestly. As you look at this growth of Geo, for instance, from 2016 to 2020, how rapidly it has grown, as has electronic commerce or online payment. Is actually, online payment in India is now one of the highest in the world. Um, so massive change happening in the digital space. Geo is also interesting in relation to its competitors, if you like. So um, working across different verticals, 22, this is last year's data, and various ones from search to publishing to streaming services to healthcare, etc., etc. As against Alibaba with the big Chinese group, 34, and Amazon, of course, the big global giant, 37. So in 5 years, 5 years, Geo is doing rather well, one would surmise from this data. And of course, one would have concerns about too much power going into one company, and that might then misuse that power for various purposes, as we say about Facebook, or we say about Google, or we say about Alibaba in the Chinese context, although Chinese context is slightly different, and I'll come to that in a minute. So we have this amazing growth, and very exciting things are happening in the digital space. Many worrying things are also happening at the same time. But we do not have in India our own platforms. Geo, with all its amazing promise, has yet to produce a smartphone which is Indian, not producing for someone else, like we're planning to do one for Google, which is going to be the cheapest smartphone in the world. It was announced months ago, in fact. It hasn't come out in the market yet, but that's India, as against China, which have very different levels of efficiency for various reasons. So one has to ask, is it because we are too dependent on platforms which are not ours? We are just, somebody used a very, derogatory phrase to describe the Indian IT sector. He said, we are electronic coolies. We do kuli ka kaam karte hain. We do coolies work. Right? We carry other people's but and we don't innovate. Although our people are at the top places in both Google and Microsoft are led by people whose first degree is from India. In fact, the guy who heads Google was close to where you guys are in Odisha. He was in IIT Kharagpur. So a very interesting contrast is with China. But Chinese internet and the discourse around it is understandably framed in this discourse about censorship and control and regulation. So this is one example of a recent publication, The Great Firewall of China, how China just restricts all kinds of debate and discussion. The internet is totally controlled, etc. All true. I mean, you have to be a totally ignorant person to suggest otherwise. But one of the things that often gets ignored in those discourses is that precisely because it was controlled, the Chinese were able to develop their own internet infrastructure. I did a book, what was it, 2018, I think it was, a book I published with some colleagues. I've been associated with various universities in China. I was mentioned, Internationalized, to be the research advisor of the China Media Center at University of Westminster in London. And in that capacity, I was able to travel to China and do lots of lectures there. And I saw the internet in operation there. So how do people manage? Because this is just, you can't access information. How do you do research? How do you think of alternative perspective? But then I discovered actually it was not as straightforward as it is sometimes projected. So in this book, I use this phrase, cyber capitalism with Chinese characteristics, But I argued that precisely because it was a controlled system, they were able to develop their own, not just platforms, but also infrastructure for those platforms. So every, as you see on this chart, every major digital property that you and I, or people like us, use has an equivalent Chinese uh, company or platform. No other country has managed to do that. Germany, France, United Kingdom, India, Brazil, Turkey, Russia, Japan, big countries. Japan, Germany, very, very sophisticated technologies, world-class research. They're quite happy to use the Googles of the world, the Microsofts of the world, and the Facebooks of the world. In China, all these are banned. And the result is there for everyone to see. Now, some of these companies are not just confined to the Chinese territorial space. Many of these are now going global. Alibaba is a prominent case in point. And in new areas like cloud computing, Alibaba is quite there at the top. Not like Microsoft or Amazon, but it's quite there in the top 5, even top 4. So here's a kind of an overview of some of the big Chinese companies, Baidu, Huawei, Alibaba, Tencent, etc., and see how many different verticals they're active in. And especially focusing on the virtual reality world, streaming services, artificial intelligence, data-driven, both scholarship and policy, etc. Very, very comprehensive. I mean, China speaks today of industrial internet. And it's worth considering, we were supposed to be the IT superpower. We haven't yet produced a smartphone which is Indian. A phone which is Indian, forget smart. 70% of smartphones people use in India are made in China. And we've been just banging on, censorship, control, etc. Fine, all this is okay, you bang on about, that's okay. But we're doing something else. And then there's also questions of surveillance and spying. And you could, as we seen last year in the context of India. So the government is one-party state, right? It's not a kind of normal state in that sense. So there are all those implications. So industrial IoT, which is Internet of Things, the whole debate about 5G, for instance. The 5G is not just about a smarter phone, it's all about everything, Internet of Things. So your fridge will tell you the milk is over, we need some more milk. Right? There's an idea of smart living, smart cities, and etc. So look at this chart. It says patents, largest patents in this field, 5G, are from Chinese companies. And think of what it means in terms of the global communication environment, because increasingly everything, as I said before, is moving in that domain. And in that domain, Chinese presence is growing. Not so much in the Western world, because there are lots of issues there, but certainly in developing world. There was a very interesting 2 volumes published last year about just one Chinese company. and how global it has become, and how issues about surveillance and all kinds of not just commerce but also security issues were highlighted in that discussion. And like I mentioned earlier, these are also companies which are investing heavily in internet infrastructure, as you see on this map. And it's also, this from Wall Street Journal, also important to see that where the focus is. The focus in this case is in global south. Look at Africa, look at Southeast Asia. Chinese presence is very, very noticeable. Part of the debate is also related to Chinese effort to internationalize its currency. China is a major power in terms of purchasing power parity. It already is the largest economy in the world. In terms of actual GDP, second only to the United States, although the difference between the two is quite substantial and is likely to remain that way for some time to come. But in terms of currency, global currency, China is still nowhere in the global hierarchy of currencies. And therefore, there's a concerted effort to cross that hurdle by going digital. So, for example, mobile payment systems in China are extremely efficient and very, very widespread. And this, I think it was last week, China officially announced that every village in China will have a 5G connectivity. No other country has, we're not even at 4G. And earlier this year, in the COVID year, they also launched a 6G satellite. So something quite fundamentally different is happening outside the American ambit. And I think that we need to take that into account. So in terms of, just go back to currency, this idea of dollar rules the world, which is true. So percentage share of foreign exchange reserves, globally speaking, dollar has 62%, euro 20, yen 5.47%, pound 4.4, renminbi, which is the Chinese, 2%, Canadian dollar, Australian dollar. Other currency, these are major countries, 2.3%. So, as I said, in relation to the Googles of the world, the trillion-dollar companies, also in terms of currency, the US imprint is very, very profound. But I also indicated there is some really significant change happening, led by China. But also other BRICS countries are doing some interesting stuff. For example, Russia also has some of its own platforms, nowhere near as big as China. And unlike China, the Western platforms are available there. And India, I think, before too long, will have that. It's a matter of time. And as I indicated, this public-private partnership, a very pro-business government, and a very, I would say, dedicated for very commercial reasons, major company, major conglomerate interested in this, I think offers interesting possibilities. But let me just end with some reflections looking ahead. Internet in a post-COVID world. Now, this is a bit premature to speak of a post-COVID world when this week itself we've heard a new very deadly variant has emerged from South Africa and is now affecting all the plans about how to deal with it across the globe. But COVID is also a very interesting marker for a shift in the way we think about the world. So, as I mentioned earlier, the BRICS began as a group after the 2007-2008 financial crisis. I think COVID is another marker. Future historians will say, well, this is like pre-COVID and post-COVID world. Maybe the Chinese dealt with it better than the Americans did, because the figures speak for themselves. Many more deaths, sadly, in the United States than in China. Much more relaxed attitude towards dealing with it than not just China, but generally in Asia, East Asia particularly. And then at the same time, you have, before even COVID hit us, you had this beginning of a Cold War, and this was a cover of Economist magazine, the battle for digital supremacy. It was very binary, United States versus China, and China trying to threaten the supremacy of the United States. But I think within the digital space, there is an interesting shift going on, and I'll just try to just bring a few points to finish my talk. First, a few words about BRICS. China, and especially China, is now speaking, okay, BRICS, we had problems with India, so we need to think of how do we make it bigger and then therefore less kind of focused. So this idea of BRICS plus, so let's invite Indonesia, Iran, Turkey, etc., Nigeria. That's one idea which is floating around. It hasn't happened yet, but might happen. And of course, BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, I mentioned earlier, has got much more prominence and priority by Chinese policymakers than BRICS. It's a useful thing, but it's not really major focus. So some people are arguing its days are over. We don't know. But is what I discussed today creating a new communication order? Because the communication order that doesn't really need emphasizing, but the fact is has been shaped, developed, controlled, dominated by very broadly Western countries, but led by the United States. And I indicated in my talk about the digital contours of that communication order. But now, with the rise of China, that has been challenged. And there are also concerns, as I also indicated, about rise of an authoritarian state, a one-party state, with very strict censorship regimes in place. What does it do to freedom of expression? What does it do to plurality of opinions? Do we want a Chinese-type internet dominating the world, or do we want a free internet, which is a synonym for American internet? That debate is already raging and has potential for reshaping the communication order. Debates, for example, about cyber sovereignty. Who has the control of your cyberspace? And shouldn't it be part of your sovereignty? Debates about data localization. In this chapter I mentioned earlier in the BRICS book, I have a quote I use from public press reports of Mr. Ambani speaking in a public platform with the Prime Minister on the dais and saying that, we have to get rid of the second colonization. This is the data colonization. This is for fight for freedom. We want our data to be in our own country. Absolutely, that's how it should be. Why should your data be with Amazon or with Facebook or Google for that matter? So even in a country which is very, like Mr. Ambani's companies, as you know, directly dealing with both Google and Facebook. They own parts of their digital properties. But the data localization debate is increasingly becoming heated. And that's an interesting area to challenge that kind of US domination. Competing platform imperialism. This is something which this idea of platforms being a new form of imperial control. Competing in the sense that although the Chinese platforms are still largely Chinese, but as I also alluded to, some of these are going out, especially in developing countries. Um, Within that, Africa is a prime target. So this platform competing, debates and are already taking shape and might get worse in coming years. And again, that might have an impact on how the global communication order is affected. Digital Cold War and weaponization of information. Um, of course, digital Cold War is already on. We heard a lot in the last 2 years about 5G and about Huawei and the kind of debates about surveillance and spying and etc. But also weaponization of information in the sense that not just in relation to these big ideas, big countries, etc., but also everyday journalism, for instance. I think of the whole malice of fake news. Think of how information is weaponized for political purposes or for hate purposes or whatever. All kinds of issues associated with that. Um, Digital for development. Again, the whole developmental discourse, which again came from the US or the Western world, is being challenged because, especially in China, where some Indians should know this more than any other country, because we have the largest number of population, poor population in the world, people living in extreme poverty. And with COVID, actually, as we know, that number has gone up, not come down. It was going down steadily. It's gone up, like in many other developing countries, for reasons, issues beyond the control of any government. It's a global, pandemic, and it's not over yet. But at the beginning of 1990s, China had double the number of people living in extreme poverty than India had. India has something like 300 some million, and China has 700 million at that time, early 90s I'm talking about. Last year, China announced officially that it has eliminated extreme poverty. In India, the numbers have actually gone up. So if you're sitting in Addis Ababa or in Dhaka or in Peru, and you say, okay, you have this, the Americans have been reducing poverty for many, many decades. The Western Europeans have this amazing, programs of aid and help to, NGOs work all over the third world, as it was called. But the, poverty hasn't gone, it's actually got worse. So maybe these guys are doing something right. We need to learn from them. Because maybe we've been obsessed with this whole censorship, control, etc. mechanism without realizing or not adequately realizing that there is an incredible potential for using this amazing digital technology for development. I mean, India has done, just imagine what would have happened if COVID had hit India and there was no Aadhaar system. What would happen to the poorest of the poor in India? You would have famine. That didn't happen. There were no riots because there was a system in place, a digital system of direct payment to people, stole money, all kinds of things happened within that system too. But it was able to deliver to the most needy. And I think, there was a remarkable project. Once the debate again in the middle class people was, it's going to be surveillance data, etc., etc. But for the people at the bottom of the pyramid, it was a mechanism through which they could eat and live in this very, very difficult time. So using digital for development purposes, I think the BRICS countries have something to offer. And that might also lead to a new kind of global communication order, because as I described it, the majority world is poor and needs development in a very fundamental sense. And finally, the whole idea of deglobalization, actually encouraged by COVID. We've seen last year, especially, most of the countries sort of were looking inwards. European Union had no policy to how to deal with this virus. So the countries were looking inward. Brussels had no policy. Italians had to go to Chinese for help. And they're very willing to help them because Italy was the first G7 country to join Belt and Road Initiative. So there is, and then this whole debate about, inward-looking in nationalism, if you like. Think of the Trump phenomena in the United States, the Brexit in UK, and various versions of nationalistic discourse, whether it is in Turkey, Russia, India, Hungary, Poland, I could go on. China, very, very strong, that kind of inward-looking discourse. So a certain process of globalization seemed to have been hit. And COVID is, as I mentioned earlier, a good marker for that. And that then leads to my final point about, does it really mean that the kind of internet that we have grown up with, I didn't, but a lot of young people have, maybe that needs to be rethought. Maybe it does need to de-Americanization is one kind of catchphrase that I use to define the situation and the phenomena. I do feel that a new order is in the making. If you remember the title of my book, our book, there was a question mark at the end. So it is not definite that will happen, but the indications, as I showed in this presentation, to me at least, show that something quite fundamentally significant is happening. And the pivot, the power is shifting away from the West. And in that space, of course, the most space has been taken by China for reasons I explained. But I think India also, people forget, before COVID hit us, India was already the 5th largest economy in the world in terms of actual GDP. It had overtaken the United Kingdom, which is psychologically very important for India. And in purchasing power parity terms, it's already the 3rd largest since 2014. So we're talking about a very serious country with lots of amazingly talented people. But the question one should be asking, why can't we develop a smartphone which is Indian? On that note, I will stop. I'm very happy to take questions and comments. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, sir, for very delighted and wonderful discussions and very thought-provoking and your critical insights about digital media and how reshaping the new global order. Before I will ask a few questions from the audience side, I wish to pass one message. I met you in IIT Kharagpur during an GAN course, the certificate course, and you are my teacher. I am so proud of you. And then before I will ask question, I would like to know a little more, not more, little more. Your 16th chapter, what is your major argument? BRICS de-Americanization the internet. If you brief something, it will be very better for our audiences.
Sorry, I thought I mentioned some of that in my talk. I was drawing from that on that chapter. For example, there is a whole section about electronic commerce and how that is growing in BRICS countries. There's a section about surveillance and spying, the data question, a whole section about data localization, a section about digital connectivity and development. So I did refer to all of these in my presentation, but the chapter is a 10,000 word long chapter. So I can send you, I have a PDF somewhere, I can send you the PDF and you can read it. I'm very happy to, if you want to circulate circulate it to friends or colleagues. Very happy to do that. Yeah. So basically, these areas I looked in more detail in the chapter.
Thank you so much, sir. So the first question for you to today's post evening. What is the successful mantra of these Chinese people? When India got independent in 1947, then in 1947 they got independent. At that time, there was the prostitution was the major income source of that area. Particular, I am talking about this Chinese people. Then what happened? India did not recover, and the Chinese people are taking in the another side of the second largest economic of this planet now.
Yeah, there are various reasons for why they've done better than us and for better than most countries actually. As I gave a precise figure in the early 90s, China had doubled the numbers of people living in extreme poverty. 700 million, we had something like 320 million. We have reduced a lot, but we still have like 200 million people who live in extreme poverty. And China has zero. And I had the privilege to travel in China, in rural parts of China. I spent a year in Beijing. I was at Tsinghua University, actually an American college, which is based in China, Tsinghua University. It's called Whsmc College, a very prestigious college. And in that capacity also, I traveled quite a lot. Not to Xinjiang, not allowed to go, Tibet, not allowed to go, but in many other poor areas. And you see the difference. You see, I'll give you a very interesting example of the difference between us two countries. This is an anecdote a French colleague told me, which is indicative of how differently our systems work. So this French colleague was in Bengaluru working for some company. I think it was a non-governmental organization. And he was in a place where there were some Chinese people who had come from China. They were setting up some business in Bengaluru, some company. And they were Indians working for this company. And they were talking about, the rights of workers and protection and all the kinds of things which you would do in any democracy. And there was people from the press who came and talked about it. And the Chinese were very impressed. You talk openly about these rights of workers and conditions, etc. So in our country we don't talk about. We just get on with work. And then so they were very impressed with that. But then suddenly sort of rains came, and this great city of IT capital of the world was flooded. And then people had no problems with this. Okay, what should we do? We should just get something to go through across the road, go to meet somebody, and that's the famous Indian jugaad system, right? And I think they couldn't understand how can these people who are so intelligent, why can't they deal with basic things like infrastructure? They have all these things about talking about how to deal with rights of workers. Wonderful, but nothing to think about how our social spaces are maintained and etc. So I think there is something in the work culture which is fundamentally different. But also, I think it is very important to understand, somebody who studies media for a living, and I'm very much connected with what's happening in my country. When I watch what is being discussed on our national television every evening, with few possible exceptions, most of what is, you just listen to it, just record and listen to it, forget about the pictures and the videos, and say, well, what are they talking about? And 99.9% is utterly tedious and irrelevant. That is our discourse. So how will you, what I asked a very simple question, why can't you make a smartphone in India when you have 1.4 billion people? Even if they're paying $1, that's $1.4 billion. because that is not the discussion. The discussion is X minister said this and the Y minister didn't say this, and then there was this ghar wapsi, and there. I mean, it is sad to just put it mildly, and therefore Chinese economy is 5 times bigger than ours. We were equal in the 1990s, almost equal, right? So we have to ask. I mean, the other problem is that we were a colony. We have colonized minds. We still think that white man knows best. And we've seen here, to use the people all over East have shown that they deal with issues which affect most people, which is poverty. So I think, and of course there is also, so just think of the big debate in India today about the farm reforms. Sorry, was that okay? So think of the farmers agitation, and this debate has been going on. At least, I mean, I'm old enough to remember this being discussed 20 years ago, or even earlier years ago, that we need to upgrade the system, right? It's not happened now because there's election in UP, and so it's going to be now another 2 years. So just think how much time, energy, wastage, the food is eaten by rats when there are millions of people who have not enough to eat. That's a criminal act, and we don't care, right? So it's at that level, and I think it's it takes a lot of retrospection, a lot of thinking that why are we not the same? We should be ahead of them because we were ahead of them. And it's not just vis-a-vis China. With China is, I mean, scale is huge, but look at around Asia, with the possible exception of our immediate neighborhood. Asia has moved on, and we haven't really caught up with it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. The second question for you. What is your assumptions after 5G going to be launched very soon in India? What media will probably do, in particular the scenario of this globalization era or digital age of 21st century's modernity?
Sorry, but I don't understand what the question is.
So,
how do 5G affect?
Yeah, 5G effect in India, in particular the age of digitalization, per se, in the globalized world.
Well, it will certainly improve connectivity because the speed and the quality of connectivity was tremendously improved. And Reliance has promised that they're going to bring a 5G, and I'm sure they will bring it. There's no doubt about it. My concern was about whether this is Indian technology, Indian platforms. That's what we should be thinking about. 5G will come. It's a matter of time. But it will have effect on not only communication more broadly, but to think of media now. Increasingly, there are mobile kind of bites of information, news, analysis that will become more pronounced, and like elsewhere in the world. But 5G, as I was saying earlier, is not just in my talk. It's not just about telephones. It's about this whole idea of Internet of Things. So I think with greater connectivity, there will be a lot more. Not just about phone. As I said, it's about your everyday life will have a great deal of digital imprint on it. And then there are also questions of how that data might be manipulated and controlled, and whether it's by corporations, whether it's Reliance or Facebook, doesn't matter, but it is in private hands, or by state, and how state might be using it for its own purposes. So, political surveillance, for instance. So it's like a double-edged sword. It has got huge potential, but also a concern about its being misused for commercial or political purposes.
Thank you so much, sir. The third question is for you, sir. Particular in this particular time of point when media is very sensitive, rightly mentioned by someone, 19th century belong to Europe and 20th century belong to America. and this 21st century's millennium age belongs to media, if I'm not wrong. And then the 21st century's life world is witnessing so many media development around the globe, but still the communication level and the journalism communication subject is not considered in UPSC in India. So what is the major challenges for the UPSC chairman and also the government of India is concerned from your side?
Journalism as a field in India is, as an academic field, that is not really developed very much. Even not journalism, I would say even communication as a field is not developed as much as it should be for a country of that size and complexity. Um, there are, this is an older tradition of very mass communication kind of research, very much influenced by the American epistemology, American way of thinking. There is so much that needs doing. I mean, young people like you should be thinking of how can we bring it down from this kind of elite narratives to what your center is doing in terms of Adivasi research and that kind of thing. So I think for UPSC to take it as a subject seriously, I mean, the subject has to raise its bar. A lot of what we teach in many places in India, and I have had some experience of teaching in some places in India, it's still, especially journalism, very, I'd say in most cases, it's much more industry driven, it's very professional kind of teaching. There's not as much theory or context taught, even about our own history, a very distinguished history, I might add, of journalism in India. Not so much in the English language journalism, that's in some places covered, but our original journalism, I mean, if you look across the country, whether it is in Tamil, Bangla, Oriya, Marathi, Gujarati, Punjabi, Hindi, every major language has had very important people, freedom fighters, people from literature, people from arts who've been journalists in their careers. A lot of great writers, because you couldn't live by writing. So either you worked in a university or you worked in media. So today, if you look around in the media world, look at the cultural commentary and see what kind of people are writing that and what is the depth of that writing. Literature has almost disappeared from our popular discourse and it's been taken over by Bollywoodized version of inane conversation about celebrities and their lifestyle. So I think, teach that, teach development journalism, a country where majority of the world's poor people live. Name one institute in India, so that they are doing world-leading research in communication development. No, there isn't research. So I think it's really a job for people like you, young people, to say, okay, get these kinds of conversation that we are having. One thing COVID has done, which is, so if I was to go to your institute, I would love to. I've never been to Odisha. I was at JNU and my PhD there. A lot of my friends came from Odisha, so I have great association with that state, but never visited. So if it was not COVID, I would go, and that will be 2 weeks of my time, which I probably couldn't do at this time of the year when I'm in the middle of finishing the semester. But I could take a couple of hours and talk to you, and through you, other colleagues. So it is possible today to say, okay, let's raise the bar of our scholarship, bar of our research, and let's get somebody from, maybe we don't know about Iran, get somebody from Iran, maybe she can tell us a bit about it. Let's talk about Africa, let's talk about China, Japan. We are obsessed with the West. And for reasons I don't need to explain, that's understandable. But I think we need to think beyond that. And even our own country, if you're studying in Tamil Nadu, you have no idea of what is happening in Punjab or vice versa. So there's so much to do, and I think once you have the quality threshold is higher, I'm sure UPSC will take it seriously, because media are, as you said, media is. One American professor once called it, we're living in media civilization, not just civilization is mediatic. So.
Thank you so much, sir. A very wonderful answer. What steps or strategies taken by the global community and by the other BRICS countries can curb Chinese dominance? Asked by Dr. Joyce Raut.
Already we've seen a kind of reaction against the rise of China, especially in the United States, but more broadly in the West, um, because there is a genuine concern that a one-party state, if it becomes a dominant player, then can we trust their data? Can we trust their platforms, etc. So that is already begun. We saw that under Trump's presidency, and the change of government in change of president in the United States has not really made much difference in policy, especially in the digital domain. Similarly, in India, as you know, last year after the border clash, um, dozens of Chinese platforms were banned, including TikTok, which had the largest audience in the world, was in India. So again, similar concerns about surveillance and spying, etc. So there is that concern, and I think it's legitimate concern. And I think we just in where I am now in Hong Kong, we did a major 3-day conference in 10 days ago here on we called it Narrating Cold Wars, and hopefully there'll be a book out maybe next year based on some of the papers, where we discussed it at some length, especially this idea of digital Cold War. So we are again back to the original Cold War argument, which is very ideologically driven, and US is obviously putting a certain, spin on it, and the Chinese are doing in their own crude way, their own kind of spinning off the story. But the process has already begun. It's going to continue, I think, isn't it? Because essentially it is raising a fundamental question about who is in control of the internet, and that's a big battle. I think India and other countries, European Union has a very interesting position on privacy, for instance. Other major countries, Brazil, for instance, not currently because the regime there is problematic, but before this, the current prime president took over, there was a very kind of progressive, especially in terms of, this might interest you, um, in your center of Adivasi work, a lot of community-oriented media in Brazil, very good tradition of that. So there are these other, emerging trends which might also balance China. So one of the things that we often think is in terms of binaries. This is China versus US. It's never that simple. It's a polycentric world. European Union, for example, is an important pole. Russia is an extremely important country. Japan is important. India is important. Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia. I could go on. So it's not like, it's all a binary. It's either or. It's always more complex than that. And I think the rise of not the rise, the recent China, how it fits into the global space will be again dealt with and is being dealt with in this polycentric way. And I think that's the right way in my view.
Thank you so much, sir. And the last question from the center's point of view. Sir, why not a single tribal journalist and tribal actors or actresses seen today's modern globalized world or glamorized world? What is the reason behind it? With this note, I would add some more information. We don't have teachers, and we don't have gurus, and in university level and also in school levels. How do you become the Viswa Guru as concerned? What is the logic behind it?
We have to respect our teachers in our culture. That's really important. That starts at school level. I mean, we need to pay them better salaries. They have regular positions filled in the millions of jobs across India, which are lying vacant in government hospitals, schools. It's just a question of priority. I mean, we have, and not just school, by the way, universities. Just look at how many central universities in India have unfinished positions in a country where there are millions of highly intelligent, educated people looking for work, desperate for work. So it's just, we need a very serious rethink about how do we raise the quality of our education, And quality depends on people who are involved. Robots can't teach people. You need good people. That's the basic line. And as far as you were saying earlier about the tribals not, or people, certain ethnicity not being in prominence, I mean, why does that surprise you? I mean, any country, the marginal groups are not in the center. It is the elite which dominates that, controls that space. But one should also remember the great things that India has been able to do is that today the president of India comes from a certain community which is considered, quite low in the social hierarchy. The vice president of India comes again from a backward community, and last but not least, perhaps most importantly, the prime minister of India comes from a backward caste, although he's never made song and dance about his caste affiliation, but it's remarkable. And forget the caste, also the economic status. You come from a very modest background and you end up becoming chief minister of a state for 3 terms and you become prime minister. That doesn't happen in China. I'm sorry. Right? It's a party elite. And have you ever seen a woman in that Politburo in the Chinese top party echelons? Mao's wife was there, and she was, blamed for what Mao did to that country. We have had, prime minister for 14 years. She was a woman prime minister. We have Mamta Didi is now challenging the powers that be in Delhi. So I don't think it's just a matter of time. It takes time for these things to change. And again, I really seriously think if the quality is good, you will succeed. And there are so many examples that you can give from the various parts of life, not just education. Where, if you are really outstanding, they may ignore you once, twice, 3 times, 10 times, 11 times. Oh, this guy is good. We need to have him or her. So that would be my thing. Just study.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. I would like to invite Professor Bikral Charan Das to go for a quick comment on sir's talk. Can you hear me, Professor Das? Hello? He might be some trouble, sir. Okay. Now I'd like to request Dr. Shravan Bag to go for a quick comment and also vote of thanks as well.
Thank you, Dr. Vikram. Very good evening to one and all. Hope I'm audible.
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So at the outset, let me to express our deep sense of gratitude and note of thanks to Professor Daya. Sir, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and delivering one of the much relevant and important talk, and most importantly, taking the entire effort of card of organizing this global series dialogue to a new heights. Your talk has really, sir, unfolded several dimensions of development indicators by giving several sparkling statistics and facts. You have raised the bar of this discourse, and of course, you have given a lot of food for thought, not only as a nation but also as an individual to this entire process of development that we are talking about. And it's truly a matter of a great concern and also an opportunity, I would say, to examine in what sense and what respect we claim ourselves as the knowledge guru and global economic changer, given the fact that you said, like, we don't have our own developed phone, and also we are struggling by and large of providing basic necessities, the new necessities rather, like internet and the sun and its services uninterruptedly. Uh, of course, overcoming the battle of digital supremacy and cyber capitalism are the new, areas that we have to really look upon. Just to add on, while I was listening to your talk, and in fact, the follow-up discussion is, initiated by Dr. Bikram, and just I was going through one of the article of India Today on 16th November, where it has, outrightly mentioned the new, developments of the global economic change, and it says that China overtakes US as world's richest nation as global wealth surges. So it's just a report from the consultancy firm McKinsey, and this in fact is an eye opener for not only the countries in BRICS, but also as a global economy when we are talking about how a country can, within a very short span of time, can took the control of entire economic power or economy that is, now in great danger, or I say at a time of crisis. So it is not only a challenge, but I would say it's an opportunity to all the member nations in BRICS and also the other countries to examine, to explore their own available infrastructure, their own available resources, and to, control, or let's say to bring back that peace and sovereignty for which we all are committed to. Of course, in your talk you have highlighted couple of emerging threats like weaponization of information and deglobalization, digital cold war are the new threats that are really going to be the game changer of the world peace and sovereignty that we are talking about. So overall, I must say, card is very much thankful to you, sir, for your enlightening talk. It has really opened up new discourse, new thematic areas for CARD as an organization also to think and to, bring our own piece of document and our own, strategize our own action plan. Because ultimately, when we are talking about development, we basically talk about at a large scale, but we all development professionals and academicians, we know that development can only be happen and can only be sustained when the change, desirable change, happens at the grassroots. And card is committed for such kind of, action, and of course we will take your advice, your guidance in the days to come. Thank you once again, sir, for giving us your time, your input, and your insight, and setting this entire global series dialogue to a new heights. Thank you so much, sir. I'll be also
Thank you
feeling,
very kind.
thank you,
Sorry.
sir. Yeah, and I'll be also feeling in my duty if I do not convey my thanks and obligation to our partnering organizations like IIM Sambalpur, Ravinsa University Cuttack, and Central University of Koraput, who have been always instrumental, and they have, set the tone of this entire dialogue right from the day one. So thank you all the partnering institutions, our mentors, our advisors who have, joined us, and they are giving their input from time to time to set the agenda of card and this global series. So thank you all for your guidance, mentorship, and contribution in one and other form. Last but not the least, thank you all the participants who have been a part of this discussion right from the day one. We believe that each day's learning have not only helped you at your individual level, but also it has raised and have, uh, sharpened your knowledge and skill to become an active citizen, and must have motivated you to bring desirable change at the grassroots level. So with this note, let me thank all of you for giving your time, your valuable comments for this discourse, and also making this evening a wonderful one. Let us dream for a new world, at least for a world where we all are living peacefully without such kind of, you know, uh, Cold War, I would say, right? Although this Cold War nomenclature has now been very popular and it is taking a different shape. So let us get out of all these reeds and, means let us live and think for a new world which is full of happiness, prosperity, and of course, equal participation. With this note, thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. And all the best for your center and for the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, and looking forward for future engagement also. And namaste from India, sir. Namaste from India.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shravan Bag.